Hi everyone. So, as evidenced by the title of my talk, sorry we're cash only, my aspiration by the end of this talk is to convince you all that credit cards, debit cards, and charge cards are all terrible and that we should all return to using cash. So, a bit about me. I'm a first-year student here at Abertay. Prior to moving to Dundee, I lived in the Dominican Republic for 13 years, which was a rather interesting experience because about a decade ago, the country had its largest private bank completely fail, and everyone who's a customer of that bank lost their money, and as a result, the payments industry in the country is just starting to re-emerge now. And prior to living in the Dominican Republic, I lived in California for about 5 years, which probably helps explain my accent. Obviously, I dig payments technologies. I'm also quite interested in the idea of user experience contrasted with security, which I'm also going to kind of go into here. Embedded devices, as well as public transportation, which I'll also kind of touch on here. So, the reason why this is hopefully relevant to us all is that every single one of us in here is going to have a card in our wallets, in our phone case, with one of these logos on it. As a result, every single one of us have a vested interest in making sure that our bank cards remain secure. And you can especially see this if you look at any breach notice for any company that's being broken into. In this case, this is the information page for the TalkTalk breach that took place in October. And two of the bits of information that are quite important in this information sheet is the financial information that was compromised, as well as the fact that the information that was compromised cannot be used for financial transactions. Fine. So we know that this is important, we know that we care about this, but then what is actually being done to prevent this from being a problem? What's being done to make sure that we can actually have some semblance of secure payments? Around 2005, 2006, all of the major card networks came together and put together a set of standards called the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. And the idea behind these standards is that if you're making a device to accept credit cards, or you're a merchant who's accepting credit cards, you have one set of rules to follow regarding how you're going to be securing your data. Manufacturers, whenever they make a device, have to be carefully audited to make sure that they're following these rules, that they're handling cardholder information adequately, whereas merchants have a bit of a different story. Merchants instead fill out sheets called self-assessment questionnaires. And this sheet here is the VIP self-assessment questionnaire, and it's the one that most stores that you'll go to today in 2016 will have to fill out as a part of accepting credit cards. Effectively, when you fill this out, you pinky promise to keep your card machines on a separate network, and you promise not to store any cardholder information electronically. It's really simple. You just separate your card machines from the rest of your stuff. The problem is that this is basically a pinky promise, because there's no one that's going to actually go out and audit every single merchant out there. It's infeasible to do that. There are too many people accepting credit cards today to actually go through and make sure that everyone is taking proper security precautions when accepting credit cards. And this is even a problem with major companies, where Target, one of the largest chains in the United States, it's a big box department store, broke the one rule, and they put their card machines on the same network as their HVAC systems. So someone was able to break in to their HVAC network using contractor credentials, and was then able to install malware onto the card terminals. But, of course, not all hope is lost, because when people fail us, we can use computers, right? So, in order to describe the typical way that card payments are processed, I want you all to imagine that you're at McDonald's, you're hungry, and you need to quickly pay. So, great. You reach into your pants, you pull out your wallet, and you pull out your card. Before, you would have had to put your card on one of these, and this is a carbon imprint sheet. I also want to highlight that this was a carbon imprint sheet in 2014, not 1914. These are still used today in the Americas for high value purchases in order to make sure that the cardholder was definitely there. But Your card also, hopefully, has one of these. And in order to understand what a magnetic stripe does, basically, in 1960, an engineer at IBM took a bit of cassette tape, pasted it onto a card, and realized that he could store data on this card, and this data could be read by machines. This card had the magnetic stripe on the front, and it only had one track, whereas modern debit cards and credit cards usually have 2 tracks, might have 3. On the first track, you'll have information that looks like this, and you have a card number, your expiration date in month, in year-month format. You'll have the cardholder name, service code, other data that the bank is allowed to put in however they'd like, as well as a 3-digit number that lets the bank know that the magnetic stripe was indeed involved in the transaction at some point, because this number isn't printed anywhere on the card. You also have the second track, which stores similar information. It doesn't store the cardholder name, and this is technically everything that you need to actually process a card payment, because you have the same card number, expiration date, service code, as well as the CVV1. So, in order to determine what type of card was swiped, the card terminal will look at the first few digits of the card number. So, if you look at this table, you can see that, for example, all Visa cards start with the number 4. And after it determines what card network the card belongs to, it can use the following 5 digits to figure out what bank the card belongs to. So in this example, any Visa card that starts with the number 465859 belongs to Barclays and is a debit card. I also mentioned a service code being encoded in the magnetic stripe data. And essentially what the service code defines is what rules the card terminal should take into account when it goes to actually process the card. So this is why when you try to swipe any of your debit or credit cards, it will tell you, no, please use the chip. This is how your bank lets the card terminal know that a chip is available. It's how it lets the card terminal know whether you're allowed to use the card internationally or not, whether you're allowed to use cashback. But as you can see, these are pretty limited rules that can be taken into account here. The other thing is that because this is a magnetic stripe, you can do anything you'd like with it. So this is a device created by Sammy, the guy who's behind the Sammy worm that took over MySpace about a decade ago. And essentially, when held up to a magnetic stripe card reader, it replays the magnetic stripe information. There's also a more commercial product available, which is the coin, which does basically the same thing. It just replays the magnetic stripe information so you can combine multiple cards into one. So, because you have direct control over what information is on the magnetic stripe, you can't trust it at all. And if your bank blindly trusts magnetic stripe data, I will buy you a pair of scissors issued by a bank that isn't that stupid so that you can destroy your card. Because you shouldn't be able to do things like change the service code in order to disable the chip, so on and so forth. And as a result, doing offline transactions is quite dangerous with a magnetic stripe card, because you have no assurance that that card actually existed. You have no assurance that that card is actually valid, because you can just change the information on the card however you'd like. So, fine, you can't do an offline transaction, so how then does an online transaction work? Again, imagine you're at McDonald's, you swipe your card, and the card terminal talks to a company called an acquiring institution. And this will be a company that the merchant signs up with, who will usually provide the card terminal and is in charge of maintaining relationships with Visa, MasterCard, so on and so forth. And the acquiring institution will then go on and ask the issuing institution whether it's okay to process the card. So this will be your bank, your building society, whoever actually gave you a bit of plastic. Then the issuing institution comes back, says yes, that's fine, and provides an authorization number. And the authorization number is an IOU from the issuing institution promising that they're going to pay that amount of money back whenever the authorizing institution asks for it. So sometime later on, usually about 9 p.m. either the same day or next day, the card terminal will upload the entire list of authorization numbers that it's collected over the past day to the acquiring institution, who will then go and claim this money back. Then the issuing institution confirms that it did indeed authorize these transactions, and it'll pay out the money, which then gets paid out to the merchant. And the idea behind this is that if the power's cut or there's an interruption in the internet connection or the phone line, the customer won't be double charged for a transaction. You can safely rerun the transaction knowing that it will simply disappear from your bank account after a few days. Now, the one thing is that a lot of banks won't show you this information. So this is an example from a major US bank where the transaction shows up as pending in the statement. I'm only aware of TSB regarding British banks that actually allow you to see this information. Fine, great, we've processed a credit card. The problem is that even after the money's been paid out to the merchant's account, we still have no idea whether that was actually a genuine card, because it may have simply been a cloned card that was actually still active. We don't know if the legitimate cardholder is going to claim that that was a fraudulent transaction yet. In addition to that, the card isn't able to strongly define processing rules. So you basically have to go online every single time that you process a magnetic stripe card in order to actually be sure that the card issuer is okay with what you're trying to do. Fine, okay, back to the drawing board. What can we do to improve on this and make card payments safer? Now, if you've lived in the Americas over the past decade or so, your card might not have a chip on it. In this case, this is a card issued to me by the second largest US bank just last year, which lacks a chip on it. But hopefully it does. You know, if it does, that's great. Then you can take advantage of these improvements in the technology. And your card might also have a contactless symbol on it, or your phone might have a contactless card on it. And these all belong to the same general specification called EMV. And EMV was developed by 3 companies in the early 90s, Europay and MasterCard, which merged in about 2003, and Visa. And the authorization flow for EMV transactions is identical. You still have the 2 separate steps to make sure that there wasn't a cut in power, there wasn't a cut in internet connection, but instead of reading data over the magnetic stripe, you're reading data over the chip that is also dynamic. It changes on every transaction. And the main goal behind EMV was to provide a secure payments environment in an assumed hostile environment. And keep this in mind as I walk through the different steps involved. The initial goal here was to provide the issuer with assurance that this is indeed a legitimate card. There wasn't much in place to protect merchants with the first initial version of EMV. So you stick your card into the reader, and depending on whether you inserted your card or whether you waved your card in front of the reader, it uses either the 1-pay sys DDF01 selector or the 2-pay sys DDF01 selector. And depending on who issued your card, the selector will then come back with a different variety of applications that are available on your card. In the United States, these different applications are used to allow transactions to be run over 2 different card networks. The regular credit networks, such as Visa and MasterCard, as well as the ATM networks, such as Cirrus and Plus, which is legally mandated in the United States. In Germany and Italy, you also see this used to provide a fallback for local card networks. So in Italy, you have the Bancomat network, and in Germany, you have the Girocard network. And both of these are enabled in cards, but also usually are provided with a fallback to Maestro or VPay. Now, this doesn't mean that all cards have to be super complicated. This is a debit card issued in the Dominican Republic, quite simple, only has 1 application on it, a Visa debit application. But even in the most simple of cases, the issuer still has a lot of flexibility. For example, you can see that there's a language preference option, which allows the issuer to make assumptions about what language the cardholder would like to use whenever they make a payment. So because this was a card issued in the Dominican Republic, it lists ES or Spanish as the first preferred language. And the card terminal can take this into account when the card is inserted and change the language of the messages displayed to the user in order to make it easier for them. Here's an example of an Italian debit card that has both a bankomat application as well as a master application. And essentially, when you use the card in Italy, it'll prefer the local network because it'll be cheaper for the merchant. But when you use the card abroad, it'll just automatically fall over to Maestro because Bankomat won't be available. And it just transparently works for the user. A more complicated example is a German debit card. And this card has quite a few applications on it. It has prepaid applications on it, allowing the user to load money onto it for offline transactions at vending machines. It has an application on it that allows cash machine withdrawals from cash machines in the United Kingdom and in Italy over the Link and the Bankomat networks respectively. It also has a master application so that it can be used internationally within the EU as well as outside of the EU. And it also has a GiroCard application for use within Germany for online transactions. And as I previously mentioned, you also have the case of US debit cards that have a special US debit application, which is used for cash machine transactions as well as transactions performed in a store over the cash machine network. But that's not to say that these applications are limited necessarily to applications that will allow you to make purchases. For example, Barclays debit cards have a CAP application, a chip authentication program application. And Barclays issue their customers with tiny machines that allow them to insert their cards into it, enter their PIN, and generate a code that's used to sign into online banking. So there's quite a bit of flexibility with what the issuers are able to do with these cards. They're full Java cards running Java, and there are a wide variety of options available here. So once the terminal's enumerated all the applications, it'll either select one using rules that it's been pre-programmed to go off of, or it'll just ask the user to pick one, as this is the case in the United States where you'll be asked to pick between debit or credit. And regardless of what happened, whether the terminal made this decision or whether the user made the decision, usually you'll have on your receipt the application ID as well as a name for the application printed. So going clockwise, we can see a Visa debit transaction, a Link ATM transaction, and finally a kind of special Visa debit transaction which was performed using a custom name for the application selected by the issuer. After the application has been selected, the card returns a processing options data objects list, which tells the terminal what sort of information it wants to initially be provided with in order to start setting up the transaction. And at this point, it just asks for the terminal country code in order to start getting an idea for what risk is involved in the particular transaction. After the terminal replies with the information requested, it issues a get processing options command to ask the card how to actually begin to set up the transaction. Oh. The card replies with two pieces of information, an application interchange profile, which tells the card terminal what requirements it should go through checking before actually proceeding with starting to authorize the card, as well as an application file locator, which just tells the terminal where on the card it can find the remaining details for that application. And at this point, using the application interchange profile, the card will signal a requirement for cardholder verification and also ask the terminal to do some risk management. So the terminal also goes ahead and checks whether it's actually allowed to go ahead and process this transaction. So this could include things like whether the card is allowed to be used internationally or not, whether the card has expired yet, but also one important thing is that the terminal should be doing public key cryptography checks to make sure that the card is actually a legitimate card. So originally with the first EMV specification, you had no such checks. The merchant had to simply go online with every transaction and figure out whether the card was genuine based off of the issuer's reply. So later on, static data authentication was introduced to the EMV specification, which allows the merchant to figure out, yes, this is a card that was at some point actually issued. It is indeed branded under the Visa network or the MasterCard network, but the problem is that it's static data authentication. So we're back to kind of similar problem that we had with magnetic stripe cards. We don't actually know whether this is the original card because you can just copy this static token over. And in order to fix that, dynamic data authentication was introduced, where the terminal asks the card to sign a random number using a private key that only the card is aware of, and using a public key which was then signed by the issuing institution and by the card network. And the terminal is able to make sure that, yes, this is a card that hasn't been cloned because it's aware of this private key. The problem is that dynamic data authentication doesn't prevent man-in-the-middling of the actual transaction parameters. It only allows you to be assured that this is a genuine card. It doesn't give you any degree of certainty as to whether the actual transaction is being tampered with. And the problem with this is that you can use a modified card at a card terminal, and the modified card will say, yes, that's fine, stay offline, this is a small enough transaction, I went online recently, make it easy on the card holder. And then when the card terminal goes to actually collect this money, they reach out to the issuing institution, who then goes, no, that's a bad card, that card's being reported stolen, and that card was told to deactivate itself. And the merchant loses out on that money. And at this point, the scammer is long gone with whatever they managed to buy using the presumably stolen card. And combined data authentication tries to fix this problem by combining dynamic data authentication with the actual cryptogram that's used to sign each of the transactions, to try to prevent this information from being modified while the transaction is being authorized. And the problem with EMV is that these are all extensions to the specification, so there's no necessarily guarantee that every card will have these. However, most cards issued within Europe will support combined data authentication, as will most terminals support it. So once the card has been validated, we know that it's indeed a real card that hasn't been tampered with. The card will provide a list of cardholder verification methods in the order of preferred usage. And this is where you see the distinction between cards that are PIN preferring, which is what you'll usually see in Europe and is the idea behind chip and PIN, or cards that are signature preferring, which is more common in the Americas, where you still have to sign even though you've inserted the card. And regardless of which verification method was selected, you'll see this also printed on the receipt. So going clockwise is a contactless transaction, which obviously doesn't have any sort of cardholder verification, just goes through immediately. A card performed using a US debit card, which was verified using a signature, as well as finally a transaction performed using a British debit card, which was verified using a PIN. And this is an example of a cardholder verification method list from a US debit card. And because this is a signature preferring card, this is a card that places fairly strict conditions on when a PIN can actually be used. In theory, the idea is that whenever you're at an unattended machine, so for example a self-checkout machine at a supermarket, a ticket machine at a train station, the card will go, okay, there's no human around, so simply ask for the PIN. In practice, however, that doesn't really actually work out. When I've tried using this particular card, for instance, at the Tesco self-checkout machines, I get a very confused attendant coming over as they have to watch me sign my card, which was particularly fun in one case where the attendant simply didn't know what to do with a signature slip. And I've had a handful of honestly unattended machines, at train stations or for instance, a pickup machine at Argos, which simply go, no, I can't process this card. In contrast, a PIN-preferring card will place very limited restrictions on when you can use a PIN. And in this case, this is a British debit card, and the only restriction on when you're allowed to use a plain text PIN is if the terminal supports it. And the reason behind this is because there are some terminals that simply lack a PIN pad, as is becoming the case in the United States, since it's slightly cheaper, as most cards will prefer a signature anyway. But in addition to that, we can also see that there are two instances where a PIN can be used. It can be used for this card in the first instance as a plain text PIN verification, or as the third CVM, as a enciphered PIN verified online. And British banks tend to prefer offline PIN verification, so that if you accidentally enter the wrong number, your card immediately comes back and says, no, that's the wrong PIN, and gives you a chance to try again without having to wait a couple of seconds for the card terminal to go online and ask your bank whether that's the correct PIN, for it to ultimately come back and say, no, that's not the correct PIN. The problem with this is that because it's offline, the terminal has to transmit the PIN to the card in plain text. So you can place a small intercepting device in between the card terminal and the card and be able to pull these pins off of the card. In addition to that, if you use offline PIN verification, there's no way to check whether the PIN was actually verified or not. The card says it would like the PIN to be verified, and the card terminal issues a verified PIN command, but although the card changes the state of the transaction and internally marks down the PIN's been verified in this session, there's no way for the card terminal to actually check that. So this attack, essentially you have an intercepting device between the bank card and the terminal, and when the terminal asks the card to verify the PIN, the intercepting device says, yes, that PIN's fine, and it tells the bank card that a signature was used instead. And the receipt will list that a PIN was verified when in fact it wasn't, and the card will be none the wiser. It'll think that it was a signature transaction. So fine, let's assume that we managed to make it through that and everything worked. Hopefully we use an online PIN verification, for example. So next up, the terminal will perform risk management assessment, and it will use this uses configuration that is put in by the terminal vendor or by the merchant, and this is where it starts to figure out how much risk is involved in this transaction, which it then uses to figure out whether it's okay with staying offline or whether it just immediately wants to go online. And the sort of factors that it keeps into account here are how many transactions has it been since the card last went online, how much the purchase is for, is this a local card, is this a card issued in another country. In addition to that, the card can also signal to the terminal, if you see this pop up, please immediately fail the transaction. And this is also part of what's used to enforce international transactions being allowed or being forbidden, and is also partly used to enforce expiration dates. So after the terminal makes its assessment based off of all these factors, it generates its terminal verification results, and it makes its own assessment as to whether it would like to attempt to stay offline or whether it wants to immediately then go online. It passes this information on to the card along with a card data objects list reply, which then allows the card to make its own independent assessment. It tells the card what the transaction amount is, what country it's taking place in, so on and so forth. And this step allows the card to override the terminal's risk assessment using the data provided in the card data objects list. And basically, when a terminal requests offline approval, the card can say, no, I want to go online. However, the card is not allowed to downgrade the transaction. If the terminal has already decided that it wants to go online, the card can only say, no, I'm rejecting that transaction, or fine, go online. It cannot force the transaction to be approved offline at that point. And depending on what assessment, what conclusion the card came to, it will return one of these 3 cryptograms over to the terminal. And sometimes these can be kind of hard to find. They're not usually printed on card receipts. Just a few of them actually show you this information. But on the left, you can see a transaction that was approved online, and on the right, you can see a transaction that was approved offline. And you can see that explicitly noted by the TC next to the cryptogram standing for transaction certificate. But if the transaction was approved offline, then fine, we can finish off there. But if the card or the terminal decided that they wanted to go online, then we actually need to then go online and do some more stuff to have this transaction go through. And the card terminal goes online, goes through the usual steps of asking the acquiring institution to authorize that card, who then goes and asks the issuing institution. And after the card terminal receives a reply back, the terminal will send CDOL2 data over to the card. And this allows the card to reset some of its counters. So this allows the card to reset, for instance, the amount of transactions that have been performed offline since the last online transaction. At this point, the issuer also has the option of updating the information on the card. And one case where I've personally seen this use was where I had a current account with a bank and then opened a savings account with that bank, and the issuing institution used a issuer script in order to tell my card that I now had a savings account available to withdraw from. So when I would go to cash machines, I would now see 2 account options as opposed to just 1. And then finally, you're told to remove your card. Good. We're done. So EMV has great aspirations. It tries to, as I said, it tries to provide a secure environment in an assumed hostile environment. And although it originally didn't do that much for the merchant, later versions now do actually have that available. Merchants do have a reasonable idea as to whether a transaction is indeed genuine or not. But we still have all of these backwards compatibility issues. For example, although the cardholder verifications method list may be signed, you can't actually force the signatures on that list to be verified, because that was an extension to the EMV protocol. There are still cards out there whose cardholder verification methods list aren't signed. So if you have a bank card that only allows for enciphered PIN verification, but you really want to get that PIN, you can just downgrade the cardholder verification method list to allow plain text PIN verification. And likewise, you see similar in contactless. One of the required parts of the contactless specification is a magnetic stripe emulation mode. And essentially, this uses the transaction counter as well as a private key stored within the card to generate different CVVs that are then put into this magnetic stripe track information. And because this is required in all of the cards, you could very well simply ask a card to sign a bunch of transactions and then replay these later on. Now, luckily, most cards, all cards issued in Europe do support the EMV mode to contactless, and that's hopefully what you'll be using whenever you use a contactless card today. But it would, and the issuer is told whether you have a terminal that supports the EMV mode, and obviously they know whether your card does. But for a while, a lot of issuers would not actually check if this matched up, where in practice they should be declining these transactions where obviously there's something wrong happening. And as a result of all of this complexity, it's difficult to find security flaws, because you essentially have to try all of these things out on live systems, which you may or may not be allowed to do. If you're messing around with your bank card, your bank might not be too happy with you about that. And if you're processing transactions, then your acquiring institution might not be happy about the fact that you're effectively attacking their infrastructure. But that's not to say that all attacks against cards have to be super complicated. This photo was floating around the internet around last week. And this is a man who was seen on the Moscow metro with a Verifone card reader. And this is a more low-tech version of the replay attack that I was describing earlier that could take place on contactless cards. He would simply go around the train, hold the card terminal to people's pockets, and hopefully catch on someone's bank card. The problem with this is that since 2009, banks have been legally required in the United Kingdom to prove that you were the person responsible for neglect of your bank card, be it the card itself, your PIN, and this can prove difficult to actually demonstrate when the bank doesn't know if the card's being tampered with, as is the case with the attack that I described earlier, where the card is told that a signature transaction took place when the card terminal is told that a PIN transaction took place. And it's certainly impossible to prove this with a contactless card, where there simply is no cardholder verification method. There's nothing to say that someone didn't bump into you on the subway, that someone didn't bump into you on the streets. But even if EMV had no flaws, even if it weren't vulnerable to this variety of high-tech attacks and this variety of low-tech attacks, card-not-present transactions only require the card number and expiration date to go through. So even though you might be asked for all of this extra information when you use your card online, you might be asked for the 3 numbers on the back, you might be asked for your billing information, Visa and MasterCard don't actually require any of that to process a transaction. Your bank might, but as far as Visa and MasterCard are concerned, you don't need any of that. And the information that you do need is sent along with every single transaction that you perform. It's on your card's magnetic stripe, it's on your card's chip, and it's transmitted when you use contactless. And this is the sort of traditional attack that doesn't go away. It's the usual skimming attack, where someone puts a magnetic stripe reader on a cash machine or on a card terminal and picks up your card number and expiration date, and then tries to go on a shopping spree on websites like Amazon, which don't ask you for the 3 numbers on the back of your card. Now, we can see that this is really an issue because when the EMV liability shift took place in the United Kingdom a bit after 2005, and the liability shift was when merchants were told that if fraud happened and their card terminal didn't support a chip, I didn't do anything, I just waited a moment. That's frustrating because that entirely hides the point of the chart I wanted to show. Right. So you can see that there was a massive spike in card-not-present fraud after the liability shift, which was when merchants were told that if someone used a card with a chip at their store but they didn't support chips and fraud occurred as a result of that, they were liable for it. And this is why we see things in the United Kingdom like verified by Visa or MasterCard secure code. And this is all part of a specification called 3D Secure, which basically tries to provide merchants with a mechanism so that they can offload the cardholder verification onto the issuing institution. And in theory, this is great because the issuing institution has a variety of methods available to make sure the cardholder is indeed who they claim to be. They could send you an SMS, they could ask you to input a one-time password, or they could quiz you on personal information. And the way this protocol works is that on the server side, the merchant asks the interop domain, which will be Visa or MasterCard or American Express, whatever the card network is, whether the particular card is enrolled in 3D Secure. Then the card network forwards that on to the issuing institution, who will then reply, yes, you can send the customer over to this address and we'll verify that this person is indeed who they claim to be. At this point, the customer is then sent over to the issuer's domain, and you'll have seen this if you're buying something online and you get a little pop-up or a little frame with your bank's logo in it. And after your bank verifies that you are who you claim to be, they send you back to the merchant and say, yes, they are indeed, this is indeed the cardholder, feel free to proceed with the transaction. This is great in theory. But as hopefully all of us know, in practice this doesn't really work out. Because quite frequently, you get this screen, and then the transaction's immediately approved, and you're not asked for anything. Or if you are asked for information, you're asked for a lot of personal details on a random website where you might not even be shown what domain this form is on. And even if you are shown the URL for this form, I don't recognize SecureSuite.net. And so fine, you would think that, so banks might contract out doing 3D Secure to some other third-party organization, and some banks do actually have this infrastructure on their own domain. So, in the case of Barclays here, they actually have this infrastructure on barclaycard.co.uk. But the problem is that Barclays don't actually ask you for any information. And even though they have it on their own domain, they're still outsourcing it to the Securi-Tay company. So even though issuing institutions have the opportunity to actually use 3D Secure to properly verify customers, they just outsource it to RSA and don't do anything. And ultimately, insurance covers all of these gaps that are left behind as a result of decades of backwards compatibility. We as customers aren't immediately hit by these things, because if there's a fraudulent transaction on our cards, our bank will just give us the money back. But we see higher prices and things and higher credit card fees as a result of these extra insurance fees. Thank you very much.